It's time for another episode of The Sean Tabbitt Show, a podcast where I connect you with thought leaders from across the globe, digging into some of my favorite topics like personal development, marketing, spirituality, and pretty much any other shiny object that happens to catch my attention. Today, my very special guest is Dr. Raymond Moody, and we're going to be discussing his book, Making Sense of Nonsense, The Logical Bridge Between Science and Spirituality. Raymond, I've been looking forward to our follow-up conversation. It's so good to see you. Welcome back to the show.
Thank you so much. You know, it's like your kindness and humor really comes through this machine we're talking through, Sean. I really have enjoyed being with you. And thanks to all the people listening in, too.
Well, truly my pleasure. Like I said, it's an honor to have you back on the broadcast. I'm not going to go into my normal origin story question because I think we spent almost 2 hours kind of talking about your journey and the fields of study that you've spent time in. So if you want to find out about that, go back a few weeks and we have a great, long, windy interview where we go down all kinds of rabbit trails. Probably one of my favorite interviews I got to do last month. So be sure to check that out. I think the place I'd love to begin today is just have you give us a little bit of the story behind the book. So in terms of making sense of nonsense, you know, I think people might have been surprised to see this book from you in this stage of your career. And I guess for you, just kind of at a, the 100,000 foot level, why this book in this stage of your career? Why was this something you wanted to really communicate and wrestle with in this latter season of your professional work?
Well, actually, the funny thing is that in terms of the development of my work, that came first in my book, Life After Life, that people know about. I say at the very beginning that I came to this field from the point of view of logic and philosophy of language, because when I was a kid, Sean, I was about 7 or 8, and I loved Dr. Seuss and Lewis Carroll and Edward Lear. Those were my favorite authors. And I loved astronomy. And so looking through a telescope, I had the experience many people listening to this will have had. I realized, oh my God, what size is this thing we're in? Either answer you can give makes no sense. It doesn't make sense that it would come to end in a wall, because there's got to be something on the other side of the wall. Makes no sense that it goes on forever either way. And that was just a big point in my life, that realization that it's okay that the world we're living in is nonsensical. And when I was about 11 or 12, I was, my grandfather was a fan of Luke Howard, who's a famous scientist who's not very well known to the public, but basically Luke Howard in the early 1800s. At that time, the idea of clouds was just unknowable. The idea of a whole cloud was ephemeral, always changing, insubstantial. And so for thousands of years, people have thought that clouds, since they mean nonsense and unintelligibility, there's no way you can know about. And that just held through, thousands of years until the early 1800s. Luke Howard, who was a pharmacist and had to travel for his business, having nothing else to do, just kind of looked at clouds and made sketches and all. And after a while, he realized, oh my God, there's different types of them. And the system we use for classifying them today, the cumulus, the nimbus, and so on, that was his system. And the thing about it was that he published the paper, and anybody who went outside could look up and say, yeah, he's right. It's just that nobody had ever thought about it because of the symbol nature. And about that same time, I had concurrently with this, I had the realization that there's different types of nonsense, right? And people think of nonsense as something cloudy, unformed, undifferentiated. But as soon as you start looking at it, you see there's a whole world out there. And that there is just, I guess, an endless number of possible different types of nonsense, each one of them having its own distinct impact on the mind. So I've been working on this for years. I started a course on this in 1969 to 72 when I was a philosophy professor initially. and teaching my students how to do this. And over the years, have got just so many wonderful, embarrassingly wonderful comments from students who, say that, that this work really changed their lives, and that basically what we've done in the West is that we dismiss nonsense as something vacuous and undifferentiated, whereas in reality, it's a whole world in there with this. Just listen to these. 'Twas brilliant the slithy toads did gyre and gimble in the wave. That's nonsense, but so is holiness pursues the vestigial lipstick of spontaneity is nonsense, and so is that cannibal you men just ate was the last one in this county, or hat thoroughly the if zoom how zest. So we can go on and on. And each one of them has its own distinctive effects on the mind and the consciousness. And this is what I've been working on for some years. My interest in near-death experience came about as a corollary of this, Sean, because these wonderful stories people tell us, this wasn't in space and it wasn't in time, and there are no words for it. The best I can say is I got into my body, I went through a tunnel and into a light, I came back to my body and returned to life. Well, that's a travel narrative, but what sense does a travel narrative have if there's no time or space? See? So that's what intrigued me about this, that when we have the most powerful and profound experience of our lives, we are forced to talk nonsense about it. And that's okay. That's okay. In the Christian tradition, for example, glossolalia, which has been analyzed by linguists to be made of nonsense syllables from the speaker's own language, put together to avoid meaningful combinations or grammatical structures. And, some people make fun of glossolalia and so on, and that's just too bad. Instead of making fun of it, maybe they should try it. It's, you don't necessarily need to be in a religious ceremony to start it, but once you just let yourself and go, you do very quickly reach an ecstatic state of consciousness, which I had never experienced before. And I can easily imagine that somebody in that state of consciousness might have it's a better opening for contact with God when you get in that state. And I think that when I had my own personal encounter with God, there's no way that you can describe that. I mean, it's beyond words, and it's you would gladly be forever in that state, just no question. And though the glossolalia did not bring you up to that height, it does put you in a state where I can imagine you might be more receptive. So, and also in other great spiritual traditions, nonsense has been a way of inducing you into profound spiritual states of consciousness.
Well, and I want to get back to speaking in tongues and kind of some of the spiritual side roads we can go down later in the interview. I love the example you gave of kind of classifying clouds. I feel like, what you described is somebody took the time to record and classify and create a framework in language about how to have a discussion, I think, around a topic. And I think that can be one of the difficulties is if we're entering into a space where there's not an agreed upon language or a structure or a grid to operate within, it's really hard to communicate. And so that in that sense, we're having to go into the nonsense space because we're, once we leave this worldly plane, we're applying time, space, all the structured words and ideas from here to something that's anything but that. And so that is that interesting in-between space that we're trying to describe.
It is. And, one that I am particularly impressed by, because for about 25 years, I've been collecting abecedaries, not every one of them, but the ones that are really, and what an abecedary is, it's an ABC book, right? And A is for apple, and typically Z is for zebra, And so if you look at the history of the abecedary, you can go down to Barnes and Noble today and get a dozen of them. And there's always really creative artists and writers coming up with new ones. I've got, I guess, hundreds of them over here. And we look at that and we think, well, that's something we use to entertain our kids with. But if you look at the history of it, there are about a dozen abecedarii in the Old Testament alone, most famously the 119th Psalm. And this was entirely for holy purposes. The ABC book was a way, as a spiritual modality for communicating with God or for issuing holy prophecies and so on. And now we see over the last several thousand years, it's gradually gotten to the point of entertainment. And yet, in reality, these devices can create spiritual experiences in themselves. I know it sounds wacky, and it's not a kind of thing that you can do in a day. But my point is that structure of communication, which is biblical, it's like it still is very, very powerful in the effects it has. One of my favorite lines from Dr. Seuss in his book, On Beyond Zebra, he says, "In the places I go, there are things that I see that I never could spell if I stopped with the Z. I'm telling you this because you're one of my friends. My alphabet starts where your alphabet ends." And what he's getting at there, as wacky as it sounds in an era where this is like a children's book, that mode of literature has a vast history going back to the Bible as a very holy form of writing.
Well, no, I think in terms of the kind of different types of nonsense that I want to jump back there for a little bit. I think for me, my favorite, and again, the book has exercises throughout. And so when you read the book, go through and do the exercises. I know a lot of us, when we're reading something, we're like, yeah, I'll get back to those later. But what I found, taking the time to do it, is I was like, okay, I had to wrestle with, okay, because you encourage us after we do the exercise to, okay, reflect on this, right? So what happened? How were you challenged? What was happening in your mind? And of the different types of nonsense, for me, I think the self-contradictions was probably the one I liked the best. And for me, it was that I took something that I thought I understood, and when I started doing the self-contradictions, I was like, oh wow, I'm actually having to wrestle with what are the limitations and the boundaries of that thing. But then I'm forcing myself with a statement to push outside of the boundaries that thing was normally bound by. And so I almost felt like I was having to write a new neural pathway in a different part of my brain I'd never used. And so I was like, okay, wow, something significant's happening here.
That's right. That's what I've been teaching this. As I said, the first time I taught this course was in 1969. I've just continually developed ever since. And over the years, that's what lots of people have told me, like students who had said that they used this and it gave them, it's like one man who's a businessman in North Carolina, an owner of a vast number of car dealerships, I guess, was saying that he felt that his business success came from that course because he used it in his business cards, which everybody identified it with, and lots of other things. I was, like I think I mentioned to you before, one of the best professional experiences I had in my life is meeting these wonderful folks at the CIA. I had no idea what that was. I thought of James Bond, but they invited me. They've invited me 2 times, and then one time to one of their guys. And what a delightful group of folks! I tell you, I mean, number one, they got to be squeaky clean to get those jobs, and also, most of them are nerds like me. That's like the hair and the shirt talent, as Kant says in his Critique of Pure Reason. But the fact that these very brilliant and very nice people have had me not just once, but a couple of times after that, that gives me, you can't tell what they're interested in, but they the fact that they have you back, what a compliment, So, and I've had a lot of response from it like that. It's basically there's a whole channel of logic missing in our mind, which we can easily patch. And then it's over a period of time. What happens is you start seeing it everywhere. It's like I had this wonderful John Rowe was a friend of mine. He was a Marine, and he was in his 50s. He had been a drill sergeant. Then he came back to college, and he had several of my courses, and he was so impressed by this. I remember he dashed into my office one day and said, "Raymond," he said, "I found out last night that I'm fluent in nonsense." Like he had listened to a Daffy Duck cartoon, which was his favorite one. And then you didn't have videos, or it was just the chance, but he got to see one the night before. And he said that before he had heard the nonsense, but after he had the course, that he could see the different types of nonsense. And why is this important? Well, I think really everybody needs to know about this, because in a situation where only a few people know about it, they can take advantage of other people. It's very easy to open a whole new logic channel in your mind. It's nothing abstract. And once you do it, you start seeing it everywhere. Like commercials. Remember, Bada Book, Bada Boom that was a commercial a couple of years ago. And it lasted a long time, which means, I suppose, that it was successful. And all the guy ever said was bada book, bada boom, which is nonsense. But lots and lots of commercials. And the reason people in advertising tell me the reason for that is that number one, people pay more attention to nonsense than they do to ordinary meaningful language. And because of that, that's what advertising is all about, is to rivet the attention, right? And they say that nonsense makes a message stick, which is interesting. Yeah.
Well, I think, I don't remember if we got into this last time, but I'd love to hear, like for you, like I said earlier, the self-contradictions, at least this time through your book. And I think, honestly, to really challenge myself, I'd probably need to go through and do the exercises 4 or 5 times to really grasp the what's happening in my brain. But I'm curious for you, is there a particular type of nonsense that you liked best, or that you would gravitate towards most?
Well, not really. I'm a great aficionado. I'm very interested in the way that nonsense plays out in science. And there it's a placeholder. That wonderful professor of physics in upstate New York, or maybe in New York City, Dr. Kaku, and you've seen him on Discover, I'm sure. And I was seeing him on one of his programs several years ago. He was explaining that the difficulty in physics now is that the 2 best explanatory systems ever are the general theory of relativity and the quantum theory. And those are very powerful theories, but the trouble is when you integrate the equations, it's nonsense. He said it's just total nonsense. So what this means is that in science, we hold on to nonsense, knowing full well that it's meaningless, but it's in the anticipation that eventually we will straighten it all out. And so that's where you see that recurrently in science.
Well, I guess kind of trying to move on a practical application. So like with the cloud example, somebody started cataloging and creating a framework and language and words to use around describing something. So if you're kind of pioneering in a new space, you might be the first person to see that intersection and record some things. But just in the day-to-day in your business, or just, is there a way that you could bring together kind of 2 different kinds of nonsense, things you would never bring together, like whether it's in a business context or a science context? Do you have any stories or examples of maybe how your students applied nonsense, even in a way that surprised you?
Well, yes, there are a lot of things. And I had this really wonderful, funny student, and he was an art student. And your art students, they always bring those big leather cases with the zipper on them, right, to the class. And I remember that. And he just loved his art. He would stay after class and show me his drawings. And sadly, as you and I both know, it's like creative occupation that's so hard. So he ended up in working in the VA and as in an office. And he said he did this graphic art piece of the Ten Commandments, and he had that 1 through 5, and then 6 through 10 on one side, and the old Roman numerals and the writing and the script. And he said that over the years he constantly got comments on it, and that's the comments were two types. He said one was people would come in and say, "Well, I'm so glad there's a Christian in the VA." But others would come in and say, "Isn't that illegal to put up a?" Yeah. But he said, but nobody ever bothered to look at it and see what it said. But it was just nonsense. And he, and I think I mentioned also the businessman who owned car dealerships, and he created this amazing series. I wish I had still had an amazing series of nonsensical business cards. And people in his community would collect them, it's like for years and years. And so he, I know this is just not true. And what he said was very nice, but he said, my whole business success, Raymond, is for, and that's an exaggeration, I know, but I appreciate the point that he made that this said, well, students just, a lot of doctors have told me over the years that they read this book or they took my course, and then they started getting their patients, and they saw immediately, that it's like patients who are sick talk nonsense. And you can one of the things that helps you find out what's wrong with them is the particular type of nonsense they speak. And like, for example, people are delirious. When they talk, it's that type, the second type I call the categorical nonsense, like holiness breeds the vestigial lipstick spontaneity. The words have meaning, but they don't fit together. And that's how delirious patients will go on and on and that. Whereas schizophrenic patients, for example, they will make up meaningless nonsense words. Well, in 1985, or 88, I went over to France, and I was with a colleague of mine who's a French psychiatrist. And I said, when French schizophrenic patients make up nonsense words, do they sound like French words? And he said, yeah. But patients who speak English, their nonsense words will sound like English words, right? So what that means is even in this dynamic of apparently lost your mind, they still follow those rules and principles, see? Or certain kinds of intoxications with mercury will make you talk nonsense, like the Mad Hatter, or just people who are terrified from witnessing an accident, even though they weren't themselves injured or harmed. When they're in the ER, they're trying to explain what happened, but so I could help the patient who was injured. You can't make a sense of what they're saying because it's all over the place. So this is very helpful in medicine, but also it's over the years, a lot of attorneys have liked this course because what they say was that it helps them with their critical thinking. When I was teaching it in one university, a retired attorney came. I thought the first day he was just like an auditorium technique. First day he was sitting like 5 or 6 rows up. Second day he was all the way down at the front. And then the second, after another course, like the next semester, he came back with several of his law friends that they took the course again, but not, it's just that the critical thinking opens up whole new ways for you to think.
Well, I love the example you gave in kind of the medical and psychiatry space by recognizing the type of nonsense actually helps you to diagnose a possible issue. So even just recognizing nonsense, like again, somebody had to take the time to record that, put it within a logical framework. In this circumstance, when you see this kind of nonsense, this may be what's happening. That's an interesting application.
It is. It is. And all kinds of things. And once you see this, you start seeing it everywhere. I think I mentioned last time, too, I was watching an Elvis concert and he forgot the words. And he just started going into nonsense until he remembered the words. And I attuned to nonsense. Oh, my God. Whereas I looked all in the audience, nobody else caught it. They just went with the flow.
Well, I think the place I'd love to go next is to glossolalia, or in my charismatic church context, speaking in tongues would be how we describe it. In terms of the ecstatic state, I'd be curious more from your research and looking into this through your years, like what's happening in the brain. Like, is it like what when somebody moves in that direction, they get into that ecstatic state? How is it changing what we're experiencing?
Well, Sean, there has been a study of glossolalia with the brain waves, and what they find, it creates a general activation all over, and that what I suspect, based on what cognitive psychologists tell me, is that every type of nonsense will register a little differently in the brain, and that you can tell that, in other words, that this you can sort of whittle nonsense to the right shape you need it, whatever your purpose is. That's and I also, in terms of the glossolalia, as I've personally experienced, is quite startling. Like I said, it wasn't to the degree that when I had my personal experience with God, but it was heading in that direction. Let's say that, and I can imagine how, despite all the people making fun of it, it's a very profound spiritual modality, I think, along with, incidentally, the Trinity. Nowadays, we think of that as a doctrine. But if you go back to the beginnings of it, the Trinity was devised it was a kind of logico-spiritual exercise. You were supposed to contemplate it and ponder it. And the idea was that this would give you an insight into the identity of God. Yeah. So it's, what is now a doctrine was once a kind of spiritual exercise, I gather.
Yeah, I mean,
and let's face it is hard to figure out what that relationship is.
Indeed. Well, and things that were new or on the cutting edge, in a different generation become the norm, and often will become just, well, it just is and accepted in later generations. That's a very different journey or experience to just be told, well, this is how something is, and you don't really ponder it, you just accept it, versus immersing yourself in the idea of the Trinity and wrestling with it. That's going to take your mind in a totally different direction than just, I accept this because you told me this is fact.
Exactly. And I think also there are psychological dimensions of this that I'm just still startled by. I still don't get. It's like, one, I discovered this, and one of the intelligence officers who came down to our place was intrigued by this. But what I've discovered, Sean, is that if you rehearse nonsense to yourself, just like you repeat some nonsense till you just say it very fluently, and then in a social situation, you start talking that nonsense to people, what it does was it sets off a reaction of some kind in their minds where they start talking nonsense back to you, but they don't know that they're doing it, which is very odd. I've done, like I said, one of the intelligence officers that I knew was very interested in this, and he came to see us, and then a few days later, he sent us this communication. He said, Raymond, my colleagues and I found that we were very easily able to recreate your finding by just going into the local Starbucks. And a lot of the students I've taught over the years will discover this for themselves too. And Milton Erickson is somebody you may not know. Is like being as a psychotherapist. He's a very well-known man. Milton Erickson was a wonderful hypnotherapist. And in one of his clinical papers. He describes how he started a new job in, I guess, a state mental hospital. And the first couple of days learning the patients, he noticed that there was a man sitting by the front door of the unit. And that when you would address the man and say something to him, he'd talk nonsense back to you. So this went on for a while. And so Milton Erickson said, well, how am I going to fix this? And so he got the stenographer in the unit to sit there and record the nonsense that this man talked. And so then he got all the transcripts and he looked at it and he learned how to talk it himself. And then the next day when he went in and he addressed the patient talked nonsense back to him. Milton Erickson talked nonsense back to him. And this went on for a couple of weeks. And one day the patient looked again at Dr. Erickson and said, when are we going to start talking sense around here, Doc? And that was what broke him out of this spell. See, so this is something that's very important, as trivial as it seems. And it has a very discrete historical origin. The logic that we're all using right now as we think about this is predicated on literal meaning, and it was conceived by Aristotle after couple of hundred years, really, of working on it. Logic finally came to be with Aristotle, but there have been preliminary steps. And Plato was the first person to distinguish between the literal and the figurative. Okay, that's where the articulation was then. But he also realized, Plato did, that nonsense is important too. And he wrote a dialogue. He pointed out several things about nonsense. One, that it makes us laugh. Think of Dr. Seuss. And secondly, that even though it's meaningless, it creates this flow of ideas in your mind, right? 'Twas brillig and the slithy toads did gyre and get something goes on in your mind, right? And he pointed out that one thing can be more nonsensical than another. But Aristotle, who was apparently a very obsessional person, anything that was out of, that was just a bit too far for him. So he let that drop. And he predicated the logic we use on literal meaning and true-false propositions. But because of that, we get into situations that we like what Dr. Kaku was saying. It's like we don't have a logic to think about nonsense. So we just have the nonsense. And but now we do. I think that we can actually break through this mental barrier we have, and to the great benefit of all of us, start thinking logically about things that don't make sense. Go back in your mind to 1915 and be a very well-educated, informed person of that era, and listen to the following three sentences. Sentence number one, all four of Ethel's grandparents perished and were lost in a shipwreck long before her mother and father were born. In 1915, that's just nonsense. Now add the knowledge of the cloning, of the gene editing, the role of DNA and heredity, and we can put together a meaningful scenario. It hasn't happened yet, but it could. Send a probe down there, get the DNA, and so on. So you can imagine. Or here's the one everybody loves. Go back to 1915 and listen to this. I watched a movie on my phone this morning, right? So the fact that something is nonsense now simply doesn't mean that it always will be. And it's a way of cracking open some of the big spiritual and scientific questions of our era.
Well, I'm intrigued by the idea of, say going into a Starbucks and introducing nonsense into a conversation. My assumption would be that on the one hand, as I'm speaking nonsense, I'm going to be activating a different part of somebody's brain where they're having to wrestle because they don't have a pattern to run this through. But then the flip side of that is there's a social pressure to take me that I must be a person who's not initially. Well, I might have to try to track, because if I'm not crazy, then they're going to have to wrestle with, well, because you want to assume the person's coming at you with rational, reasonable language. So I could see two parts. You're impacting their brain, but there's also a social pressure on you as the receiver to receive and almost respond in kind. So those two working together must produce that nonsense response almost.
I think there's something like that. I can't figure it out, but I see it happens, but I don't know why. And I at first thought that people with very rigid personality would, but no, that doesn't work either. So I don't know why, but it's like you have to do it with great confidence, right? You got to really talk as though you're meaning something, but even though it doesn't, and it just triggers things in people where it puts them into some other state.
And I think we got a couple more questions before we wrap the interview. I think the place I'd love to go next, you have a chapter, I believe, on misusing nonsense. Now, again, I work in the charismatic publishing space. Lots of stuff about prophetic words and stuff like that is really normal in our space. And I was just really fascinated by how you explored kind of judging or discerning prophecy, and just kind of, I'd love to have you just take us into some of the space you cover in that chapter, because as somebody who operates in a space where we're trying to discern what's good to share or publish and what's not, I felt like I'm going to have some good takeaways from that chapter that's going to help me in my professional work. So tell us a little bit about that content.
Well, I'm not talking there about real prophets, right? I'm talking about fake prophets, like Nostradamus is one of the ones I analyze in there. And if you analyze his writing, you see that it's nonsense, but that people sort of fill in whatever they want the prophecy to be. So, and I've known people who do use that to manipulate other people. So if you carefully note the logic of the way that a prophecy works is that some of the Nostradamus's prophecies are so vague that they're bound to be fulfilled, right? It's like there's one I remember, it's 2 royal sons will battle so fiercely that, whatever. Well, there's always 2 royal sons battling. Right now there is, right? But what? But the others prophecies of Nostradamus don't make any sense at all. The Thane will mark on 4, 9, and 11 before noon, or things that don't make sense. But what happens is when the vague but meaningful prophecies, like 2 royal brothers will do battle, are fulfilled, which they always will be, that motivates the believers even more to get into this nonsense that makes sense to us. So it's a technique that Nostradamus used, and I've noticed it the same thing with modern day so-called prophets. But I am not talking here about prophetic discourse, right, and sincere people.
Well, and for me, again, that was not something I expected to necessarily encounter when I started the book. And for me, again, we're in a role to really try to discern and analyze what people are writing in a book or that they want to share. And so, our heart is this somebody who's leading us down a bad path? And should, so to even process some of that through the framework you laid out in the book, to process what Nostradamus was sharing, so to speak, I could see applying some of that same logic to analyze the stuff that we're exposed to or dealing with. To, I feel like it, again, like I don't know if we talked about this in the interview, or this might have been before, but again, what I appreciate from stepping outside of my lane, my professional lane in Christian publishing, is by coming through your lens of how to analyze Nostradamus and prophecy, gives me the opportunity to think about what's in my lane through a slightly different angle or a framework, or, okay, what's the logic path? If you express something this way, how is it impacting the receiver and pushing them in a direction? Or is this so vaguely general that this is going to apply to 95% of the people who encounter it, or that sort of a thing? So while I might, where my belief of whether something's legitimate or not, I might, and with my own spiritual journey, base some of that more on that. I love that you challenge me to go and look at it from a completely different direction and go, oh, I could actually analyze this in a different way. And maybe it would be helpful for me to analyze from this other perspective, just to be a more discerning person. So that's one of the ways I'll actually be applying what I learned in the book to what I do professionally. So that was a wonderful surprise to me.
Well, also, over the years, many people in dealing with the religious community, how there's a certain kind of mind that says the idea of God is nonsense, right? You've heard that. It's the criticism of the logical positivist of the early 20th century. What I have always thought, yeah, that's right. The idea of God is nonsense. And that may sound like the way of saying that God doesn't exist, or like sound like an insult. But if you think about it, it's really a true statement about the human mind. The idea that I, Raymond Moody, am going to put a circle around God with a concept, right? That's just absurd. It's like people once in a while ask me, Sean, they said, do you believe that God exists? And I always say, no, absolutely not. Because, number one, I, Raymond Moody, am a limited person. Any belief that I could formulate about God would be bound to be off base. And secondly, if you think of that sentence, do you believe that God exists? That word exist is the emphasis of the sentence, right? But as a logician, we could go through an hour and I could explain to you what it means to say that something exists. I could even show you how to symbolize it. But when it comes to God, I give up. What I say is, I don't believe that God exists. I have a relationship with God. See, I think it's like, I know a lot of people whose main activity related to God is they're speculating and wondering and arguing whether or not God exists. But I'm speechless by that, because why do I have to wonder about whether God exists when I have a relationship with God? See what I'm getting? We can get too intellectual about our relationship with God.
Well, and I think, and this kind of, I feel like gets at the heart of the whole discussion. It's, again, when we're referring to God, we're often having to anthropomorphize and apply human traits and just worldly structures to try to even have that language of what to talk about. But, whether it's the concept of God existing or some of the other ground we covered, or and the place I want to land as we wrap up is how nonsense helps you to understand the afterlife. But just we're trying to explain the not fully explainable. We're trying to express something that we failed to have. It's like people trying to talk about their afterlife encounter or their heaven or their hell experience. Most of them will tell you, I'll explain it as best I can, but there just aren't words to classify the fullness of the experience. And so, that is the challenge. And I feel like wrestling with this idea of nonsense language helps us to kind of force our brains out of the box to be able to express some of those things better. But in terms of, again, you've studied the afterlife for many decades, nonsense language in the afterlife, how do again, two things I would have never brought together.
And there's two ways. One is that even though words like, sentences like there is life after death make us feel good, we have images and all, in terms of the meaning of it, it's not very clear. It's like a self-contradiction, right? There is life after the final irreversible cessation of life. And all of the common usage words we use to talk about the afterlife have that quality. And people, as you say, who have these spiritual experiences, no matter how eloquent they are, say, I just can't describe it to you. What I have found is that if you prepare people in advance with this new form of logic, then when subsequently they happen to have a near-death experience, they will come back and describe it in a new way. So what it does, it breaks down the old language barrier. We already have a lot of near-death experiences related through the literal meaning logic of Aristotle, which makes it a travel narrative. But now we say there's something fishy about that, because how can you have travel when there's no space and time? But now see, a new group of people who've been through this will have the near-death experience, and they won't put it that way. They will put it in a slightly different format. It's already happened once, by the way, with a wonderful scientist and artist who had this experience after taking my course. And he said that he said, Raymond, he said, when I was over there, my mind went back to the seminar. And he said, I saw that what you're saying is true, that you can't comprehend how that world is connected to this world unless you take the unintelligibility axis into account. And this is so much verbiage. So to think of it this way, we all have heard that it's 4.3 light years out to Alpha Centauri. But, how did they figure that one out? I mean, you can't put a odometer on a homing pigeon's wing. So how do you do it? Well, by the late 1800s, the measurements were close enough. They understood that it's 186 million miles across the orbit of the Earth around the sun. So when the Earth was here, they measured angles very closely, then waited 6 months later, and now you have it from a different angle, and that's how you can tell. And now we have a similar way with these near-death experiences. We can reformat our mind in advance, which does lots of good things for us on Earth, if you're an attorney or a physician or a writer. And then when you happen to have a near-death experience, it will give us a whole new way of relating it. So in the not too distant future, we'll have the travel narrative types and these other new, I don't know what the format would be, but it's something. So it'll be a way of triangulating.
Yeah, I mean, I think again, there's also just the precedent of how people have explained these stories in kind of the NDE space. They've all come across as travel narratives. That's how the stories have been told. I could see coming at this from a different direction or a sideways direction where you're more wrestling with what does it mean to be here or exist in a different place? Like that's a different kind of wrestling. That's a different kind of way of expressing something versus I went here to there and then I came back to here. That's different than, okay, I still had my mind and my faculties and I found myself, I was suddenly in a different place. Again, is that even the right word? But you're telling the story through a different perspective would be the best way I could describe it.
And it's fun. I hope this, what my aim in life, Sean, I'm sure yours. I mean, it's like I'm finished with myself. It's like I like to say, I'm tired of Raymond Moody, but what I'm here for and whatever remaining time I have, I just want to help other people. It's that sounds like an ideal when you're young, but by the time you get to my age, it's just a fact of life. As long as you're focusing on yourself, you're always miserable, right? Isn't it true? It's when you really want to help other people that things become really nice.
Well, and when we wrapped up our previous interview where it was to talk about life after life and your book, I think your memoir, Paranormal, and just it was just a very broad, fun conversation just to talk about your kind of personal and professional journey. And at the close of that conversation, you challenged me to dig deeper into the nonsense book and do this follow-up conversation. So for the men and women who listen to or watch this conversation, for you, what would be your call to action for them to pick up the nonsense book and wrestle with it? Like I've already implied throughout the conversation, it stretched me. It made me look at things through different angles. I like to do that kind of stuff. I'm a marketing person. I'm a creative person. So I like things that put me out of the box. I also help people tell their stories about supernatural experiences and religious experiences. So again, I want to be challenged to put language on top of things that might not have ever been applied in that way. So for me, this fits right to the place that I live in so many different ways. But just for the average person who they've never even thought they needed to care about nonsense, why do they need to read the book?
Well, because it does open up parts of your mind that you don't know you have. And that's what my students over the years have said. It's a way of thinking about things in a whole new way. Yeah. So that's why. Yeah.
Well, and
I'll also ask if anybody could find any holes or flaws in this. I would greatly appreciate it. But I think it's pretty solid because I've got some pretty bright people who can't find any holes in it.
Well, and I think one of the fun aspects of this book and just the season we're in, I feel like a lot of people have almost lost that ability to think logically or rationally. We're just in a season where people are almost programmed to respond. They see something, they respond, and they don't take that time to think. And so I'm intrigued on a book like this that forces us to get into outside of the box and almost think of nonsense, when so much of what people I think encounter in media and culture is in and of itself almost really just nonsensical. And so, maybe this can be kind of a backwards way to pull people into a way of actually starting to think again, as opposed to always just be triggered in response. It's actually for me, it's one of the concerning and challenging realities of our day.
I absolutely agree with. It's like we have lost the sense of delayed gratification. It's sad to see.
Well, once again, our book today was Making Sense of Nonsense, the Logical Bridge Between Science and Spirituality. My guest is the wonderful Dr. Raymond Moody. It's just been a joy to have you on the show again. Man, I appreciate you pouring into me, pouring into the audience. It's just been so much fun.
Likewise, thanks so much to everybody for listening in. And thank you, Sean. You're just delightful. This is so much fun.